Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me reasonably well. My name is Chad Staddon, and I'm a member of the HWISE Research Coordination Network, RCN, executive, along with Wendy Jepson from Texas AMU, Amber Wootich from Arizona State, Justin Stoller from Miami University, and Sarah Young from Northwestern. Together, we have co-produced alongside dozens of site PIs from around the world a data set called HWISE, Household Water Insecurity Experiences, which I'll be drawing on in my analysis of household scale water technologies in this presentation. Many of you probably are already aware of the HWISE consortium. You're probably already receiving the newsletters and updates via the listserv, and that may well be how you discovered this webinar and others like it. I've got a little bit to say about HWISE and what's going on in and around HWISE in the context of this presentation. The presentation itself should take around 30 or 40 minutes. And then we've got plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So also, I should say, I'm happy to make the slide deck available to anyone who wants it afterwards or wants to pick up on any particular point in the presentation afterwards separately. That's fine. One of the things I'm really hopeful out of this webinar is that I can identify other colleagues who might want to participate in further thinking about the critical socio-technologies of household water as reflected through data sets like HWISE, but not limited to HWISE. So if, like me, you're interested in how households configure culture, technology, economy, and social practice and relations to produce water security, then just reach out and let me know, and I would be delighted to welcome you into the speech community, the community of thought and practice. Okay, with that introduction, let me start the slide deck. There we go. So folks should be seeing the first slide in a series of slides with the presentation title, Household Water Technology Preferences as Expressed in the HWISE dataset. I'd like to acknowledge my two co-authors to date who've helped us get this far, Tanti Octavianti and Dee Tour. And I think Tanti may well be joining us on this webinar. Okay, let's press on. So the presentation is in 5 parts. I want to talk briefly in a moment in a theoretical vein about the role of technologies in what I call hydrosocial transitions. I'll talk also about data collection methodology. This is where I'll talk specifically about the HWISE process and the HWISE global data set. I'll then return not to the whole data set, but to a part of the data set that speaks particularly about socio-technologies of water. I'll then spend a little bit of time looking a bit more deeply at a single site, Labuan Bajo, on the island of Flores in Indonesia. And then I'll conclude with some reflections on comparative hydrosocial contracts and transitions. So I begin and finish in a social theoretical register. The empirical work in the middle is largely quantitative. Okay. So the hydrosocial transition is basically the notion that in any given place and time, you can uncover what Tony Turton and Richard Meissner from South Africa call the hydrosocial contract that prevails. They describe the hydrosocial contract in terms of the quote you see in front of you. It's essentially a contract that might be written or unwritten, is probably a bit of both. And it comes into existence when we reach the scale of population growth, density, and urbanization, where individual households can no longer provide immediately for their own water needs. At that stage, other technologies, actors, institutions, and agencies begin to mobilize around the challenge of providing water services. Those things acting together cohere in what Tony and Richard call the hydrosocial contract. Some years ago, I'll come back to that slide in a minute. Some years ago, my colleagues and I at the University of the West of England developed this notion of hydrosocial contract a little bit further, suggesting that at least in Europe and North America, you can identify an historical transition from one hydrosocial contract to another and then to a third. And in some work published up to about 3 or 4 years ago, we had a 3-phase model where we talked about an early phase before the First World War called hydroprecarity, a middle phase called hydromodernism, and a contemporary phase called hydrosecurity. And then down the rows on that table, we looked at the economic systems, the political systems, the water management ideologies, the engineering paradigms that prevail across specific hydrosocial contracts. And then we looked at phase change in different urban and national contexts. So part of what we're doing here through the HWISE data set is asking ourselves, how well does this model apply to non-European, non-North American contexts? That's as yet an unanswered question. Let me go back to the earlier slide briefly. So one of the things we're really concerned about in thinking about hydrosocial contracts and hydrosocial transitions is we're concerned not to be too deterministic in our thinking. We need first to avoid any homo economicus notions or homo technologicus notions. As many of you will be aware, much of the literature about urban water history or the history of water services is very technologically determinist, which means that it's a story of the invention, uptake, and proliferation of new technologies. And in particular, it's usually a story of the triumph of modernist engineering to solve water problems. And of course, the economic systems, the technical systems, and the political systems that get wrapped around that. Good examples of literature in that vein include Patrick McCulley's Troubled Waters and Mark Reisner's book about water in the Southwest, Cadillac Desert. One of the problems with these treatments is that they tend to be quite deterministic, and we're after uncovering the much more subtle interplays between individual and household level decisions, which of course are socially and culturally inflected, and yet also constrained and enabled by surrounding and enmeshing political and economic systems. Okay, so that's our theoretical framework. We're trying to think about how the HWISE data set allows us to see these hydrosocial contracts and these hydrosocial transitions in places around the world where the HWISE survey was applied between 2017 and late 2018. The HWISE data set is a data set that was designed originally to address a key problem, which you see on the slide in front of you. There are currently very many data sets and water security indices, water poverty indices that think about the physical environment, they think at the state level, and they may think at the individual or even the molecular level, but very few that operate at the household level. And so the HWISE consortium in 2016, 2017 asked itself, could we produce a cross-culturally validated data set that would allow us to compare levels of household water insecurity across sites that geographically, socially, and economically vary around the world. In the course of doing this, we implemented a large survey initiative across 29 sites in 23 countries, most of which you see depicted on the map you're looking at now. In most cases, the minimum threshold number of surveys was about 250 for each of those sites. In some cases, we achieved significantly in excess of that. In some cases, more than 400. So we ended up with quite a large data set. Now, our original purpose was to design a cross-culturally comparable, cross-culturally valid, comparable composite household water insecurity scale. And so this slide depicts the phases of work that went into producing that scale. And here in the bottom right-hand corner is one of the publications where that scale was announced to the world. It appeared roughly 14 months ago, 15 months ago now, I guess, in the British Medical Journal Open. And then at about the same time, another publication appeared that talked specifically about the methodologies behind the scale itself. So we took a really large data set collected in 29 sites in 23 countries and put it through phases of item reduction to come up with a 12-question set. These are the 12 questions we identified from the global survey that we can ask in any context around the world, crunch them together into a composite index, and we have an index that is comparable from one site to another or from one point of time to another. Separately, if people are interested, we can talk about some of the gory methodological details of putting together this scale. Why 12 items and not 10? Could we reduce the scale further to 6 items or however many items? We can talk about those questions if you want after the presentation. I just wanted to make sure that participants in the webinar understand that the data set we're drawing on was originally designed to produce this HWISE Household Water Insecurities composite indicator. And an attempt to represent all of that data crunched together for all of our sites rather dazzles the eyes. It looks like this. So this is one of the supplementary items that appeared in the BMJ paper as supplementary materials, and it's an attempt to encapsulate the global data set for the composite water security indicators across the 12 questions. In parallel, my team at the University of the West of England developed an R-based data visualizer for the HWISE data set. At that time, we were working with development organizations like Oxfam, Water Witness International, and WaterAid, and they were interested in a tool that would allow them to access and analyze data without making things too terribly complicated. So we developed this visualizer, which relies on some standard representations on a site basis. So now we're looking at individual sites. We are not looking at the entire data set across the world. We're picking individual sites and looking at distributions of response to specific questions. And in this case, we've got a variable width box and whisker plot for showing primary source of non-drinking water in the Labuan Bajo site in Indonesia. Another representation we developed in the visualizer is a box plot, a scatter plot, and a line fit, which was designed to allow users to quickly test whether or not there are statistically significant relationships between dependent and independent variables. In this case, between reported household income and household water insecurity score. Okay, so we've got a massive data set. We've got something like 9,000 responses from 29 sites in 23 countries, and then a few more were added to the global data set after that. From the point of view of thinking about water technologies and some of the other things that were asked about in the data set, we've got an opportunity because we can ask ourselves, what does this global data set that was produced for the HWISE indicator process tell us about other things to do with the realities of household water insecurity? What does it tell us in this case about technologies, or what I'm calling here socio-technologies? And early on in the process, we decided at the University of the West of England, we wanted to tell a story that was not just about the global data set and not about only single sites. We wanted to somehow inhabit the middle ground. And so we picked a limited number of variables, which you see there. I'll talk them through briefly in a minute, and a limited number of sites. And the challenge that we set ourselves was, what kind of qualitatively contextualized story can we tell, drawing on the HWISE quantitative data about the technological choices that households are making in the 6 selected case study sites. We conceptualize that technological choices in household water security strategies involve thinking about source, which is this first circle on the left. And that resolves as 2 variables in the HWISE dataset, WAT1 and WAT2, which you'll see again shortly. How does that water get from the point of source to the point of use or transport? And we've got 3 variables that talk about that. What happens when water gets from source to end use point? How is it stored and managed? We've got 3 data points that tell us about that. And then finally, how is water treated? And we've got 3 different variables that tell us about that. So what I'd like to do is talk you through briefly some of the data that we've got for 6 sites across these 4 socio-technological moments. Okay, it'll take a minute to get your eye in. This is a rather complex chart, unavoidably. What we've got here is that each color represents one of 6 different locations: Kampala, Uganda; Upolu, Samoa; Gressier, Haiti; Rajasthan, India; Labuan Bajo, Indonesia, which I mentioned earlier, and Torreon, Mexico. These 6 sites were originally picked for reasons of contrast. We were interested in discovering whether or not we could pick up contrasting signals in the data and then explain them contextually. What WAT1 tells us is where respondents are drawing their primary source of drinking water. And what you can see quite quickly is that a large number of respondents, particularly from Upolu, Samoa, are taking their primary source of drinking water from piped supply. But there is a wide range of different technological choices that are drawn on by respondents across the 6 sites. So while a majority of Samoans are drawing their drinking water primarily from piped supply, very few Indonesians, residents of Labuan Bajo, are doing the same thing. Very few Kampalans, Ugandans, are doing the same thing. So you can see difference already emerging in the primary source of drinking water across these 6 sites. Again, we see differences in the time taken to collect water, which in our data set is WAT3. And it would appear visually from this data that respondents from Rajasthan are spending the most time amongst respondents collecting water. In terms of the amount of money spent getting water, which is not quite the same thing necessarily as the amount of time spent procuring it, again, we see difference. Residents of Labuan Bajo seem to be spending perhaps disproportionately more money getting water than residents of Gressier. and then resolved as a proportion of total monthly expenditure, which is a common measure for looking at thresholds of water poverty. Again, we can see a quite wide distribution from 0% of monthly expenditure to more than 20% of monthly expenditure being spent on procuring water. Looking at storage, we can see that there's a tendency for many respondents in many sites to have some storage, perhaps as little as 50 liters or less. As many will know, a standard way of moving or transporting and storing water is the 20-liter jerry can, ubiquitous throughout Africa, Asia, and South America. So this would be having 2 or 3 of those on hand, potentially. But there are a large number of respondents, a significant number of respondents who report storing considerably more volumes of water, usually in some kind of purpose-built below ground or above ground structure. In one of the research sites I work on in southwestern Uganda, these are usually molded plastic or ferroconcrete rainwater storage tanks. But they can also be underground dug structures, dubbed in line structures, such as you may have seen in parts of Rajasthan and elsewhere. So now we come to the 4th technological moment in this trajectory, treatment. And the simple question here was, do you treat water? And you can see a significant number of respondents, particularly in Kampala and Labo and Bajo, said yes. And a significant number of respondents, particularly in Rajasthan and Torreon, say no. And the other 2 sites are perhaps a little more variegated. You drill a little bit deeper and you ask people how they treat water. And you see that for those who do treat water in Kampala, the overwhelming majority choice is to boil it. In Gressier, people are still reporting no treatment, but where they do treat, they are adding chemicals, probably sodium hypochlorite sachets. In Labo and Bajo, it's a mixed solution of boiling, filtering, and no treatment, basically leaving water on the presumption that impurities will simply physically settle out. I want to talk now a little bit more about one site only, Labo and Bajo. It's a site that my colleague Stroma Cole has long done research on water and distributional equity in that community, as well as others in Indonesia. So when we were approached to join the HWISE process, one of the things we brought to the party was another site to study. Here you see some basic statistics about Labo and Bajo in comparison with 3 of the other sites that I've been talking about, Kampala, Uganda, Gressier, Haiti, and Torreon, Mexico. Tells you a little bit about the survey numbers we got here, 279, of which 44.8% of respondents were female. A little bit of demographic data about the community. When we did the survey, which of course is quite important, the kind of climate, Köppen climate type that prevails in that location, and a little bit of information about socioeconomic status and levels of urbanization. Again, we were looking for comparison and contrast within the data set. Okay, so these representations come from the R-based data visualizer. And what you see here is an attempt to represent how water insecure is Labo and Bajo compared with 3 of the other sites we were looking at, using a box and whisker plot. So in this case, what you see is the gray box is Labo and Bajo. It's the 3rd from the left or 2nd from the right. The line through the middle is the median value, so the most popularly, the value above and below which 50% of the distribution lies. and its value was 14.4, if I recall correctly. In other work, looking at the ability of the HWISE index to discriminate between water security and insecurity, we've tended to find the cutoff point between security and insecurity is around 12. So if the score is more than 12, the location is relatively water insecure. If it's under 12, it's relatively water secure. So with that in mind, you can see that Kampala is relatively water secure according to its median, as is Gressier and Torreon. Labuan Bajo emerges as relatively water insecure, although perhaps not extremely so. The boxes around the medians show where roughly 2/3 or 1 standard deviation of the distribution lies around that medium. So it is reasonable to say that most of respondents responded in Labuan Bajo with composite answers between about 18 and a little less than 10. So you're getting most respondents within this gray box for that site. And then the whiskers, the lines above and below, show where the rest of the variation lay. So what we learned from this box and whisker plot, given in this format, is that of the 4 sites, respondents in Labuan Bajo self-reported as more water insecure. Although there is evidence of significant water insecurity in some of the other sites, as you can see from these tails at the top of the distributions. Looking now only at Labuan Bajo and asking ourselves, well, where do they get their water then? What is the nature of this water insecurity? What you see here is something similar to, I think, the first chart I showed you in this presentation, a primary source of drinking water for Labuan Bajo. And here you see that the residents of Labuan Bajo, respondents to the survey, report relying on a wide variety of different kinds of sources of water, from bagged or packaged water through boreholes, bottled water, piped water, protected dug wells. It seems that across the 279 respondents, somebody is using virtually every kind of option we gave them, except for unprotected sources. But you're also seeing that although there's wide variation, there are some central tendencies. There's a tendency to rely on a combination of packaged water, boreholes, piped water, and dug wells, and maybe standpipes as well. The width of these boxes tells you, it gives you an indication comparatively of how many people answered in that response category. And then the other thing that this plot does is it shows you how primary source of drinking water compares to HWISE score. So in this case, you can see that by and large, the HWISE score is around 15 for most of the sources identified. You would probably expect that given the previous plot that showed you that the composite average HWISE score, irrespective of any other variable, was about 14.4. So it's probably not surprising that in this case, there are some scores that are a bit higher, but they seem minority, and some scores that are a bit lower, but again, they seem minority. The central tendency across this variation of sources of primary drinking water is for an HWISE score around 14 or 15. In Labuan Bajo, as we noted from an earlier representation, the majority choice for water treatment is boiling. You can see here that of those who reported that they boiled water, their HWISE score sits smack dab on the population score for that site. Others who say they don't treat it are reporting a higher HWISE score, but there aren't too many of those. Some people said they filtered and they have a lower water insecurity that possibly reflects the amount of capital resource they have available to manage systems like that. And then unfortunately, we do have a significant number of people who in this site chose not to answer that question. One of the other questions we asked, well, we asked this question two different ways in the broader survey. We asked people to place themselves on a ladder of socioeconomic well-being, where the bottom rung was relatively well off and the top rung was relatively poorly off. So we asked that question in terms of socioeconomic well-being, a ladder of socioeconomic well-being. We then asked it in terms of a ladder of water well-being, and that's what's reported in this image. So you can see that for those who reported that their water situation was relatively good, so it's relatively low on the y-axis, they're also reporting elsewhere in the survey a low HWISE score. So there's a sense of internal consistency within the data set for this site at any rate. You also see that as respondents are reporting that their water situation is worse and worse, or less and less good, their HWISE score tends to go up. That's what this red line is suggesting. This line is actually just a line of perfect correlation. If for every 1 unit increase in, or 1 unit decrease in water situation, there was a 1 unit increase in HWISE score, everybody would be sat on that line. Instead, of course, they're not quite, because reality is a bit more complicated than that. So I've given you a lot of statistical information and numerical information, but I said at the outset, thinking about hydrosocial contracts involves contextualizing that quantitative data in a qualitative context. What is going on? What else is going on in communities like Labuan Bajo that allows us to better understand this quantitative data? In a nutshell, we suggest that in Labuan Bajo, there are a number of things operating, ranging from poor coordination of existing government policy, devolution that is as yet incomplete and unaccompanied by financial mechanisms. So a few years ago, the Indonesian government decided that the best way to improve water services and achieve SDG 6 was to devolve responsibility to lower administrative units for so doing. They gave the responsibility to lower administrative units without necessarily giving them the financial means to achieve those new responsibilities. We wonder sometimes whether the fact that Indonesia is a relatively wet country with significant monsoonal rains in parts of the year has to some extent led at least national authorities to be relatively less interested in water issues compared with other issues. I'll come back to that supposition in a few minutes. Probably this leads to the fourth point, which is that there's relatively poor data availability and no state requirement to publish, which means qualitative data beyond the data that we've collected about the water situation in Labuan is data that we have to go to Labuan and collect ourselves or collect with our research collaborators in Labuan and Flores. Okay, just a couple of slides left before I wrap up and open up for further discussion. I'd like to bring the discussion back to where we started, to the theoretical context. I'd like us to reflect briefly on what I'm calling comparative hydrosocial contracts. So the original challenge was to explore what the HWISE quantitative data set could tell us about prevailing hydrosocial contracts. What is it about the relationships between citizen and state, between economy and citizen, and within local culture, or cultures, plural, that is somehow reflected in this data set on experiences of water insecurity? Oops, there we go. So I've spoken mostly about Labuan Bajo, and I've done it very quickly, and my apologies if this has felt like a bit of a rush through that one site. But what we're trying to write up is a paper that compares now 4 sites. We started with 6, but we've put Upolu Samoa and Rajasthan, India off to one side for methodological reasons we can talk about later if you like. And we're looking at these 4 sites. And what you can see visually here across some of the key domains within the HWISE data set is variation as well as similarity. I hope that's actually apparent just immediately visually comparing these 4 different bar plots. So the question is, what does the variation and the similarity tell us about hydrosocial contracts in those locations? And how do we conceptualize those differences? Well, one of the things that's abundantly clear from our study in Labuan Bajo is that the role of the state is very important. What is the state's positionality with respect to thinking about water, water security, and water services? And so in thinking about this presentation, I hypothesized that perhaps there's a continuum between states that are relatively activist, however that can be unpacked, and at the other end of the continuum, states that are relatively passive. So a relatively activist state might have lots of policies, a strong regulatory arm, and it might even be financially underwriting WASH investment and SDG 6 progress within its national territory. Conversely, at the other end of the spectrum, we can see some states are quite passive, relatively disinvested financially as well as politically, and sometimes even antagonistic to those activities that are going on, particularly within the parastatal and non-statal communities, to address SDG 6 and water security. Another axis that seems to be relevant in this context is the status of water as a good within the local economy. And here, this is probably much simpler to conceptualize. At one end of the spectrum, we can see water as a private good. It's a commodity with an exchange value, and the attempt is made to make it a uniform good that can be exchanged on a marketplace, versus water as a public good, what the lawyers like to call res nullius, goods that no one owns, perhaps managed through a process of usufruct, or first in time, first in right, to use the American phrase. It's encountered predominantly in terms of its use values, what it's good for, rather than what it costs or what profit I can make from it. And it's usually, in this sense, a non-uniform good. And I go back to that distribution of different sources of water that residents of Labuan Bajo were drawing on to try and meet their household level needs. To me, that bespeaks a certain sense of non-uniform goods. This is the second to last slide before we open up for questions. Where we are in our thinking is an attempt to place the 4 study sites within this XY plot space as follows. Perhaps it's a little bit polemical, and if it causes perhaps some colleagues to react and object, I shall be delighted, because I'm pretty sure I don't have this right. I take full responsibility for this if Tanti's listening. In Kampala, Uganda, it seems to me that the state is becoming increasingly activist, and if I was to put an arrow, it would be upward. I think the Ugandan state, year on year, particularly over the last decade, has become progressively more activist in thinking about SDG 6 progress and the MDGs before that. However, it is also a state that is deeply distrusted by its citizens. The Ugandans that we surveyed through the HWISE process, and the Ugandans that I've worked with in parallel projects elsewhere in Uganda, simply don't trust the motives or activities of the state that claims to be acting on their behalf. So I encapsulate this as suspectus imperium, or the distrusted state in Latin. In the other corner, in Grecier, you seem to have the opposite problem. You've got absens imperium, the absent state. The kind of water service provision that seems to be emerging in Grecier seems to be largely a function of the activity of parastatal organizations and NGOs, and very much a patchwork affair. Perhaps less from the site study in Gressier, but also from studies I know in adjacent communities, I get the sense that the situation is highly variable from one district or one neighborhood to the next in Gressier and in Haiti more generally, reflecting the relative presence or absence of parastatals and non-governmental organizations within Haiti, and the absence of a coherent state response to SDG 6 progress. Torreon and Labuan Bajo are somewhere in the middle. For Torreon, Mexico, and for reasons we can discuss in the question and answer if people are interested, the state positionality looks to me like a kind of a distraction or a distracted state. So this is confusus concessit imperio, or the distracted state. Mexico is a fascinating case study in water services provision and interactions between different levels of state apparatus, because on the one hand, it's got a very strong water bureaucracy that operates at many different statal levels within the national space of Mexico. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem to be yielding the proportional results, or results that are proportional to that quite strong and well-embedded water bureaucracy. And if my colleague Adriana Zuniga-Taran was on the phone, she's from northern Mexico, she would, I'm sure, have a lot to say about this sense of ineffectuality or distractedness in Mexican water policy. And finally, in Labuan Bajo, we seem to have a case of archipelago imperium, or what we might call island states. What happens in Indonesia seems to depend on exactly where you look. And maybe that's partly a function of its archipelago geography. I'm not much of a determinist. I try to avoid it at all costs. And so hopefully someone will challenge me on that, and hopefully Strom is on the call and can give us a few more details about Labuan. Thank you very much, everyone. As I said, the slide deck is available to anyone who's interested, and I now open the floor to questions and answers. So I think there's a function here for putting your hand up virtually if you want to make an intervention or add a qualification if you happen to know something useful about any of these sites.
Hello, Chad. Can I?
Yes. Hello, Ellis. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I see you and I are doing the lockdown beard.
Yes, we are. So very fascinating talk or presentation. So in thinking about the hydrosocial transition or contract itself, that the scale at which it is presented appears more national to me, even though data would be collected subnationally across different communities. So how do we think about that in relation to, say, rural versus peri-urban and then urban, where how technologies emerge and play out may be very different, even though it's the same national context?
That's a very good question, Ellis. And you've put your finger on one of the real weaknesses of where our analysis is right now. Because on the one hand, we've got the HWISE data, which talks about specific sites within nations. And we're always at pains to say that data from a given site does not represent the nation within which that site is located, right? We didn't do a nationally represented survey. But on the other hand, the qualitative data, the contextual data that I presented too quickly towards the end of the presentation is national scale.
Right.
And so there is a disconnect there that is problematic, and it's something that's got us scratching our heads and thinking quite carefully about how do we bridge that gap. We're desperately keen to produce a contextualized analysis of HWISE data, something that goes beyond the statistics. Because as you're aware, we've done some pretty impressive statistical modeling with the data set, addressing different kinds of questions. But going beyond that, the challenge here is to say, okay, how can we pull the quantitative data into a qualitative context in a useful and productive way? I really don't think we've quite managed that. I work a lot in Uganda, and in Uganda, there are many Ugandas, to be honest, and the survey was done in a part of Kampala that has a particular history, a particular set of social structures, ethnic structures, linguistic structures. And I think we need to know a lot more about those things before we can feel very comfortable about where we are with this attempt at contextualizing the quantitative data.
Okay, good. I will let other people ask questions. I have one more question and I will ask that along the line.
Okay, thanks, Ellis.
Yeah.
Other questions? Hello, Rahul.
All right, unmuted myself. Hi, Chad. This was a really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your presentation. So I'm based in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States, and you know, in Detroit, it's interesting how a small minority of people are going through intense water insecurity issues related to affordability, but the broader population in general seems largely unaware, or, you know, they don't really necessarily listen to or care, or, you know, they're not really overly concerned about some of these affordability or security concerns. So I guess my question for you is more in terms of sampling, in terms of, were you trying to get a representative sample? Were you a little more concerned about particular ethnic groups, income groups, and I guess how are you making sense of, you know, across these different sites, how that, you know, that there might in fact be different experiences or perceptions based on whose you know, experiences you're trying to tap.
Okay, thanks, Rahul. Three types of responses, or three strands to my response to your intervention. First, you may be aware there is a group led by Leila Harris from the University of British Columbia, who's specifically looking at applications of the HWISE tool or adaptations of the HWISE tool for higher income countries. We originally developed it for lower income countries, thinking about SDG 6 progress and all that kind of stuff. But last November, Leila hosted a conference in Vancouver at UBC to ask about how do we think about water insecurity in more affluent, higher income contexts. So if you're interested, I can put you directly in touch with those folks to help you think about Detroit. The second thing is about sampling. In the case of this study, we looked at the 29 sites that were available to us through the HWISE data set. Labuan was an easy choice for us because my colleague Stroma Cole knows it very, very well. And my postdoctoral researcher, Tanti Octavianti, is an Indonesian national. So that was kind of a first choice that was easy for us to make. We picked 5 others, and we were looking for similarities as well as differences. So we picked a couple of island states, Grecier, Haiti, or island sites, Grecier, Haiti, and Upolu, Samoa. We picked a few arid and semi-arid locations, Rajasthan and Treon. And we picked places that experience strong monsoons as well, like Kampala, Uganda. So it was driven by an attempt to contrast as well as compare. Then through the course of beginning to develop that quantitatively, we discovered there are various peculiarities with the data sets for Samoa and Rajasthan that have caused us to put them to one side. I'm not saying that the data are poor, I'm just saying that it's a bit like apples and oranges. And we wanted to keep all our oranges in a basket. We found we had 2 apples inadvertently, Upolu Samoa and Rajasthan. And so we've put the apples over to one side. We'll come back to those later. And we've got the 4 oranges that we're carrying on with. Yeah, so that's sort of where we are now in response to your question.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes, please, Alice.
So I think the last few slides in thinking about the role of the state or how the state is perceived, and I think that's an area that is getting some attention. I've seen some recent work by Yafa Trulove asking questions about who is even the state. But I think I find fascinating the way you link like parastatals, for example, NGOs, the roles they play, and relate that with the state. And in Malawi, for example, the state presents itself as activistic because it supports the parastatal, right? And so I'm sort of wondering how you think through where you may make conclusions about the state's inactivity because delivery and infrastructure revolves around the involvement of parastatals, when in fact there are contexts where the state, it's not necessarily hiding behind the parastatal, but it's a bit of withdrawal. But the flip side is it withdraws and finds different ways to support the parastatal. And by doing that, calls itself so activistic in moving the SDG 6 agenda forward without being directly involved.
Thanks for that question, Alice. And again, a very apposite challenge to the schema that I presented in the last few slides. As it happens, my team has just started working in Malawi, in Lilongwe.
Let's talk
so maybe
more.
we can have a separate conversation about that. I've been once to Lilongwe, and what I found fascinating was that it just feels to me that the relations between the actors, statal, parastatal, non-statal, in Malawi, in Lilongwe, I won't say Malawi, I'll just say Lilongwe, is palpably different from what I encounter in the parts of Uganda where I work.
Okay.
And I can't put my finger on it quite so well. I would say that it seems, if Lilongwe is a good example of how the Malawian state is thinking about these things, it's more benign, and as you say, it's supportive. And it's much more routinized.
Right.
In Uganda, often I find the relationships between those different kinds of actors, and we're actually, of course, an actor within those contexts, is often much more turbulent, and it's much less clear what our positionality is, what our status is, officially or unofficially, the extent to which, for example, we're officially condoned or merely tolerated.
Right.
And our Ugandan government, or they would say, LC4, LC5, LC6, those being the key levels of administration in the Ugandan context for us, tend to, they recognize this. They know that this is a bit turbulent, a bit uneven, a bit chaotic or unclear.
It's an interesting area. I mean, especially thinking about it not as a political scientist, right? With the questions about scale and perception, but that's helpful. Thank you. We'll talk separately about Malawi for sure.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ellis.
Okay.
Open the floor to other questions or interventions. Okay, let me make a few concluding comments, and anyone can feel free to jump in if they wish while I'm doing so, and then I'll close the webinar. As I said at the outset, and as I said a couple of times during the presentation, we've reached a stage in the development of this analysis where we think we're doing something that's interesting and useful. We're not trying to deal with the entire quantitative data set, a data set with more than 9,000 entries in it. We're not trying to operate at that level. There are other colleagues within the HWISE community that are doing that, and they're doing a wonderful job. But we're also not trying to talk about single sites. We're trying to live in the middle ground and say, well, with respect to questions like technology, but potentially also questions like gender or affordability, what can a contextualized comparative approach offer as we bounce geographically disparate locations such as Torreon, Mexico, off against Grecier, Haiti, and Labuan Bajo, Indonesia? What do we learn by doing that in a way that is contextualized at an appropriate level? And I think that webinar participants can see that we're still very much on that journey of finding that balance point and that appropriate contextual level. One of the ways we can get there is if we have more partners who know these locations reasonably well, who put their hands up and say, look, I'm happy to jump in and set you straight about some things that you're not quite getting yet, because we know we're not quite getting a lot about some of these sites. So if anyone is interested in getting involved in this line of analysis about socio-technologies of water at the household scale, send me an email and I'll link you to the group that's starting to think about these things. We're doing all the usual scholarly things, generating papers, et cetera, et cetera. And we'd love for you to be part of that community if your interests lie in those directions. I'll remind you that anyone who's interested is welcome to contact me for a copy of the slide deck that I presented today, and maybe we can then use that to have some bilateral discussions outside and beyond this webinar. And other than that, I want to thank everyone for attending. I hope you've gotten some value out of the presentation. It's been fairly interesting. Oh, I see we've got one chat from Jeff saying, thanks very much, very interesting. Thank you very much, Jeff. And do please reach out if you want to talk further about these questions. Thank you, everyone, and have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are on this wonderful earth.